Chicago, a city built on steel, sweat, and secrets. From the gambling dens of the 19th century to the smoke-filled back rooms of the outfit, power in this town has never been accidental. Who were these men and women? Big Jim O'Leary, Dean O'Banion, Capone, Virginia Hill, Ricardo, Iupa, Cerrone. Were they criminals, businessmen, power brokers, patriots of their neighborhoods, or predators of their own city? For over a century, they shaped elections, controlled unions, built empires, and ordered executions, often in the same breath. Their influence reached beyond Chicago to New York City, to Kansas City, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. But their roots were here. This is not a myth. This is not Hollywood. This is history. And I'm James on the Mob. He was a man whose reputation for violence wasn't just whispered about. It was demonstrated. One method in particular came to define that fear, what became known on the streets as the Calabrese necktie. It was simple, controlled, and terrifyingly effective. Cord or rope looped tightly around the neck, tightened from behind, cutting off air, and then the victim's throat was sliced from ear to ear, usually with a stiletto knife, sending a clear message to anyone watching or listening. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated intimidation, a tool of enforcement in a world where fear was currency. And for years, that method and the man behind it kept people in line. Welcome back to James on the Mob. I'm James Jenkins, your host and narrator. Today, we're going to take a look at Frank Calabrese Sr., a man who embodied the brutal duality of the Chicago outfit, a ruthless enforcer with a reputation for violence, at the same time, a highly effective earner who generated steady streams of income through relentless loan sharking operations. For years, that combination of fear and profit made him a powerful and protected figure. But in the end, it wasn't law enforcement pressure or rival crews that brought him down. It was betrayal from within his own family. His testimony from both his son and brother helped seal his fate in the family secrets trial, leading to a life behind bars, where he would ultimately die in prison, alone. The story of Frank James Calabrese Sr. is essentially the story of the modern Chicago outfit, a criminal organization that, unlike its counterparts on the East Coast, maintained a monolithic and terrifyingly efficient control over its territory for over a century. To understand the man known as Frankie Breeze, one must look back to the streets of Chicago's West Side in the late 1930s. Born on March 17, 1937, to James and Sophie Calabrese, Frank Sr. entered a world where the shadow of Al Capone still loomed large. But the organization was beginning to evolve into a more professionalized entity under leaders like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo. Growing up in the neighborhood known as the Patch, Calabrese was immersed in a culture where local mobsters were not just criminals, but the actual arbiters of social order and financial power. His formal education was cut remarkably short. Calabrese dropped out of school in the 4th grade at approximately 13 years of age, later telling jurors in his 2007 federal trial that he spent his youth selling newspapers on Grand Avenue. This lack of schooling was not merely a matter of academic indifference, but was compounded by a physical hardship. A severe bout of scarlet fever left him hospitalized for over a year and deeply impacted his literacy, resulting in a lifelong struggle with dyslexia. These early challenges forged a specific kind of street intelligence, characterized by a photographic memory for debts and ruthless ability to manipulate the social dynamics of the Chicago underworld. By the early 1950s, Frank Calabrese Sr. was navigating the difficult transition from a street-level thief to early adulthood. In 1953, at the age of 16, he made a formal attempt to enter the structured world of the United States military. While many of his peers were being drafted for the closing stages of the Korean War, Frank chose to enlist in the U.S. Army. This decision was more than likely an attempt to find direction or perhaps to escape the cycle of petty crime that had already begun to define his adolescence. However, the transition from the lawless environment of the West Side to the rigid rule-bound culture of the military proved immediately problematic. The Army required a level of conformity and submission to authority that clashed with Calabrese's developing sociopathic tendencies and his resentment of structured commands. His dyslexia also likely made the bureaucratic and educational components of military training significantly more challenging than the physical aspects of it. The details of Frank Calabrese's time in boot camp remain sparse in public records, but the outcome of his service was definitive. He successfully completed his basic training and was assigned to a subsequent duty station. However, his commitment to military service vanished almost the moment he moved beyond the controlled environment of the training facility. Historical records and testimony from the 2007 Family Secrets trial indicate that Frank Calabrese Sr. went absent without leave, AWOL, exactly 5 days after completing boot camp. This desertion marked the end of his potential military career and represented his final rejection of legitimate social institutions. By walking away from his post, Calabrese signaled that he was unwilling to answer to any commander who did not operate within the ethical framework of the Chicago underworld. Following his desertion from the Army, Calabrese returned to the familiar streets of Chicago, where he fully embraced a life of crime. Without the shield of military service or any legitimate prospects, his criminal activities rapidly escalated from neighborhood thefts to professional racketeering. By 1954, at the age of 17, Calabrese's criminal career had officially begun with an arrest for auto theft, which resulted in a 2-year prison sentence. This early incarceration served as his true graduation into the world of organized crime. In 1964, he was whistled in to the outfit by Angelo "The Hook" LaPietra. LaPietra was an up-and-coming soldier in the Chinatown crew, also known as the 26th Street crew, and he would become the mentor who shaped Calabrese into the most prolific loan shark and enforcer of his generation. During the 1960s and 1970s, Frank Calabrese Sr. became the primary engine of the Chinatown crew's financial success. Operating primarily out of the Italian-American club on 26th Street, Calabrese managed an expansive and brutal loan sharking operation that the federal government later estimated grossed more than $2,600,000. The juice loan model was deceptively simple, but mathematically inescapable. Calabrese provided cash to hundreds of customers at exorbitant interest rates that varied from 1% to 10% per week. These were not just loans of last resort for desperate gamblers. They were instruments of total control. If a debtor fell behind, Calabrese's crew was instructed to do anything necessary to collect, which often involved the seizure of the victim's car, their home, or their entire business. One notable example of this predatory business model was his acquisition of an auto repair shop in River Grove, Illinois. When the owner, Matthew Russo, fell behind on a loan, Calabrese effectively took control of the shop, later using it as a 1990 racketeering scheme involving an Elmhurst car dealership, Solozzi Edelson Chevrolet. The dealership would direct car repair work to the mob-controlled shop in exchange for kickbacks, a sophisticated arrangement that showcased Calabrese's transition from simple street thug to a refined racketeer. The family dynamic was central to his criminal operations. Calabrese groomed his sons, Frank Jr. and Kurt, as well as his brother Nicholas, into the business. Frank Jr. began collecting juice loans for his father at the age of 16 in 1976. The extended family often congregated at a 3-story home in Elmwood Park, known as the Compound, located on 74th Avenue. In this environment, Frank Sr.'s word was absolute law, and the family business was treated with a religious devotion that superseded all other moral considerations. It was this conflation, blood family and crime family, that would eventually lead to the organization's most dramatic internal collapse. The definitive moment of Frank Calabrese Sr.'s career occurred on October 9, 1983, in a secret induction ceremony conducted by outfit boss Joey Aiupa at a restaurant on Roosevelt Road. Frank and his brother Nicholas, alongside others like fellow crew member Johnny Apes Monleon and future outfit boss James Jimmy the Man Marcello, were made members of the Chicago outfit. The ceremony was a chilling ritual that Nicholas Calabrese would later describe in detail during the family secrets trial. A prospective member was taken into a room containing a knife and a gun. candle and a card bearing a religious image. His finger was pricked and blood was spilled onto the holy card, which was then set on fire in his hands. As the flames rose, the inmate chanted, "If I give up my brothers, may I burn in hell like this holy picture." This oath was not merely symbolic, it marked Calabrese's official entry into the upper echelons of the outfit's enforcement wing. He became the central figure in the 26th Street hit team, an elite crew of hitmen who carried out the boss's most sensitive capital punishments. The 26th Street crew was reserved for targets who were either dangerous to the organization or whose deaths required a high degree of public impact or forensic clinicalism. Core members of this group included his brother, Nicholas, called Nicky Slim, and Ronnie, the little guy Jared, all reporting to Angelo the Hook La Pietra. The crew operated with a level of impunity that stemmed from their belief that they could control police investigations and even bribe judges. Frank Calabrese developed that signature method of assassination during this period, again often referred to as the Calabrese necktie. This brutal redundancy was a hallmark of his sociopathic approach to violence. He did not merely kill to resolve a conflict, he performed executions with a clinical focus on the finality of the act, a trait that would eventually be used against him when his own son and brother testified to the gruesome details of his work. The chronological list of murders attributed to Frank Calabrese Sr. begins with the August 1970 killing of Michael Hambone Albergo. Albergo was a mob loan shark collector who had apparently voiced the opinion after being subpoenaed by a grand jury that he wasn't going down alone. Frank Sr. reportedly told his brother Nicholas, "We got to put somebody in a hole," marking Nicholas's first direct involvement in the outfit's flattening operations. The brothers strangled Albergo, Frank slit his throat before burying him in a location that remained a mystery for decades. For years, the FBI operated under the theory that Albergo's remains were buried beneath a parking lot at U.S. Cellular Field, then known as Comiskey Park, the home of the Chicago White Sox. In latter years, agents would even rip up concrete in an attempt to find the bones of the murdered loan shark. But the remains were never found, illustrating the effectiveness of the outfit's disposal methods during the 1970s. This murder was the first of many that established the Calabrese brothers as the Chicago outfit's version of Murder Incorporated. Throughout the late 1970s, violence escalated as the outfit consolidated its power across Chicago and its suburbs. The timeline of murders Frank Sr. was eventually held responsible for includes the June 24th, 1976 killing of Paul Haggerty, the March 15th, 1977 murder of Henry Cosentino, and the January 16th, 1978 assassination of John Mendel. Mendel was targeted for the particularly egregious offense of robbing the home of Tony Big Tuna Accardo, the outfit's most revered elder statesman. These killings were followed closely by the January 31st, 1978 double murder of Donald Renault and Vincent Moretti in Cicero, Illinois. Nicholas Calabrese would later recall that he and his brother named these murders the Strangers in the Night murders, as that was the song that played on the jukebox as the violence went on. This period demonstrated Calabrese's relentless activity as an enforcer who moved seamlessly between the high finance world of the juice loans and the raw violence of street assassinations. On July 2nd, 1980, Frank Calabrese Sr. participated in what would become one of the most infamous hits in Chicago history, the double murder of William and Charlotte Dauber. William Billy Dauber was himself a feared outfit hitman and enforcer who had run with a Southside chop shop ring for years. But he had become a liability after his wife was arrested on drug charges and he began cooperating with federal authorities. The outfit's leadership decided that Dauber had to be eliminated, but previous attempts by the rival Cicero Wild Bunch crew had failed, leading Frank Sr. to remark that he was being sent in to light a fire under their asses. The hit was executed as a high-speed chase through the rural roads of Will County. As the Daubers drove home from a courthouse appearance in Joliet, they were intercepted by a Ford van containing Frank Sr., Butch Petroselli, Gerald Scarpelli, and Ronnie Jarrett, with Jerry Scalise acting as the driver. Scalise pulled alongside the Daubers' Oldsmobile, and the gunman opened fire with shotguns. Billy Dauber attempted to evade the shooters, but his car eventually careened off the road and crashed into an apple tree. The gunman didn't simply drive away. The van backed up, and the shooters finished off both Billy and Charlotte Dauber as they sat in the wreckage. The van used in the hit was later found torched just a mile away, a standard practice for the outfit to destroy forensic evidence. This murder was particularly significant because it involved the killing of a mobster's wife, a violation of traditional mafia codes that signaled the outfit's increasing desperation and cold-bloodedness under the leadership of men like Ayupa and La Pietra. Following the Dauber murders, Frank Calabrese Sr. continued on a spree of violence that aimed to eliminate any internal or external threats to the outfit or the Chinatown crew's revenue streams. The murder of William Butch Petroselli, a prominent member of the Wild Bunch hit squad, was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a multi-crew operation sanctioned by the highest levels of the outfit's leadership, including Angelo the Hook La Pietra, the capo regime of the 26th Street crew, and Joseph Joey Doves Ayupa, the overall street boss of the Chicago outfit. William Petroselli, born in 1937, was a career criminal and a specialized enforcer for the syndicate. During the 1970s, he operated within the Wild Bunch, a group that included notorious hitmen such as Harry Ailman, Gerald Scarpelli, Tony Borsellino, and James Jimmy I. Inendino. This crew reported directly to Cicero Capo, Joseph Ferriola, and was responsible for high-stakes enforcement, including the collection of the street tax from independent bookmakers and the execution of those who resisted. Throughout the 1970s, Petroselli and his associates in the Wild Bunch were responsible for a series of high-profile gangland slangs, including the 1977 Chop Shop-associated murder of Sam Anarino in Oak Lawn, Illinois, and the 1980 assassination of William and Charlotte Dauber. The motive for the conspiracy against Petroselli began to crystallize in late 1980. Despite his value as a technician of violence, Petroselli had begun to violate the fundamental codes of the organization. Federal investigations and internal intelligence suggested that Petroselli had skimmed approximately $250,000 in street tax collections. This money was vital to the outfit as it was intended to support the families of incarcerated members, like the family of his closest Wild Bunch mate, Harry Ailman. Furthermore, the outfit's leadership grew suspicious that Petroselli was communicating with federal authorities. The intersection of financial betrayal and potential cooperation with the government made his death an administrative necessity for the Chinatown and Cicero street crews. On December 30th, 1980, the conspirators initiated the final phase of the plan. Using a common mob tactic known as the lure, the group invited Petroselli to a meeting in Cicero, Illinois. Because Petroselli was a hardened hitman himself, he would naturally be suspicious. However, the involvement of a trusted associate like his fellow Wild Bunch crewmate, Gerald Scarpelli, ensured his compliance. Upon Angelo La Pietra's signal, "Take out the trash," Petroselli was led to a specific location in Cicero, an office situated at the edge of an alley with a narrow gangway. The site was chosen specifically because the surrounding buildings blocked any line of sight from the street, ensuring the act would remain hidden from public view. Upon entering the office, the betrayal was instantaneous. Nicholas Calabrese, Jimmy La Pietra, and Frank Santucci were already positioned inside, while associates Frank Furio and Johnny Apes Monteleone provided security outside. As Petroselli stepped through the door, the group immediately swarmed him. Nicholas Calabrese and the others held Petroselli down on the floor to prevent him from drawing a weapon or resisting. Frank Calabrese then manually strangled Petroselli until he was dead, pulled out his knife, and slit his throat. The execution was described as rapid and clinical. For Calabrese, it was personal. He had been itching for some time to kill Petroselli, who he described as a spacon, or a big shot. Following the murder, the conspirators took immediate steps to dispose of the evidence. Frank Calabrese Sr. removed the car keys from Petroselli's pocket and left the scene to locate his vehicle, a 1977 Ford LTD. The remaining members wrapped the body in blankets to prepare it for transport. The corpse was placed in the back of a Ford LTD, which was then driven to the 4300 block of West 25th Street on Chicago's southwest side. Nicholas Calabrese later admitted that he doused Petroselli's body with Zippo lighter fluid in the backseat of the car. The body was subjected to severe burns, particularly on the face and torso. However, the attempt to completely incinerate the evidence was partially unsuccessful because the killers rolled up the car windows before leaving, which snuffed out the flames due to the lack of oxygen. The resolution of the Petroselli murder only came through during the landmark Operation Family Secrets investigation. One of the most spectacular hits of this era occurred on June 24, 1981, when Michael Cagnoni, a business rival of the outfit's transportation interest, was targeted. Cagnoni was killed in DuPage County when a remote-controlled bomb exploded under his car as he was driving on the on-ramp to the I-294 tollway. The timeline continued with the July 23, 1983 double murder of Richard D. Ortiz and Arthur Morawski in Cicero. This period solidified the reputation of the Chinatown Crew as the most profitable and most violent arm of the Chicago outfit. The most famous of the murders attributed to the Operation Family Secrets investigation was the double homicide of Anthony and Michael Spilatro on June 14, 1986. Anthony, Tony the Ant Spilatro, had been the outfit's overseer in Las Vegas, a position that made him both immensely powerful and a significant target for federal law enforcement. However, by 1986, Spilatro's erratic behavior, high-profile media presence, and an affair with the wife of another mob associate had made him a liability to the bosses in Chicago. Spilatro brothers were lured to a home in Bensenville, Illinois, under the pretext that Michael was to be officially made into the organization and that Tony was to be promoted to the rank of capo. Instead of a ceremony, they were led into a basement where a group of outfit hitmen, including James Marcello and Nicholas Calabrese, were waiting for them, and they weren't smiling. The brothers were viciously beaten, stomped, and strangled to death in what Frank Sr. later described as a necessary nail in the coffin for a member who had betrayed the organization's trust. Their bodies were transported across state lines and buried in a shallow grave in a cornfield in Enos, Indiana, where they were discovered on June 22, 1986, by a farmer. While popular culture often depicts the Spilatros as being buried alive, the testimony from the Family Secrets trial confirmed that they were killed in the Chicago area before being moved. Frank Calabrese Sr. was recovering from an illness at this time and was still upset that the outfit had left him out of participating in the murder. Just 2 weeks after the Spilatro hits, the outfit turned its attention to one of its own again, John Big Scoop Feckerata. Feckerata was targeted for several fatal, most notably his botched burial of the Spilatro brothers, whose quick discovery had brought unwanted heat to the organization. He was also suspected of sharing sensitive intelligence with his wife and girlfriend. The contract for Feckerata was given to the Calabrese brothers, and it would ultimately prove to be the fatal error that brought down the entire crew. September 14th, 1986, Frank Sr. and his brother Nick lured Feckerata to a phony hit, which turned out to be his. During the struggle to kill him, Feckerata fought back, and Nick was shot in the shoulder. Nick continued to pursue Feckerata, finally cornering him in the vestibule of a bingo hall on Belmont Avenue. In the frantic escape to the getaway car, driven by Frank Sr., Nick accidentally dropped a pair of bloody gloves. These gloves were recovered by investigators and sat in an evidence locker for nearly 2 decades, serving as a silent witness to the crime. This botched hit was the turning point for the FBI's Chicago office. The forensic evidence from the gloves would eventually provide the DNA match that broke Nicholas Calabrese's silence in 2002. The script of Frank Sr.'s life during the late 1980s was one of continued dominance, unaware that the smallest of physical details, a drop of blood on a glove, had created a direct line from the Fecarata murder to his future life in prison. It highlighted the inherent incompetence that often accompanied the outfit's brutality. The early 1990s marked a period of increasing pressure on the Chinatown crew. In 1990, Calabrese's kickback scheme at the Elmhurst dealership was compromised when the M&R auto shop owner, Matthew Russo, became an undercover government informant. Russo recorded several meetings with the mobsters, providing the FBI with the evidence needed to build a comprehensive RICO case. On July 28, 1995, the federal government finally acted, indicting Frank Sr., his brother Nicholas, and his sons, Frank Jr. and Kurt, along with several other associates. The group was charged with using threats, violence, and intimidation to enforce a loan sharking racket that had spanned from 1978 until 1992. In a surprising move, Frank Sr. and his sons pleaded guilty on March 21, 1997, just weeks before their trial was set to begin. During the sentencing hearing before U.S. District Judge James Holderman, Frank Sr. attempted a display of remorse, stating, "I'm very sad that this brings my kids into something that should never have happened." He was sentenced to 118 months in federal prison and ordered to forfeit $750,000 in illicit profits. However, the incarceration did not end the family's involvement in the outfit. Frank Jr. and his father were sent to the same federal prison in Milan, Michigan. It was in this environment that the long-standing dysfunction of the Calabrese household finally turned toxic. Frank Sr. had previously held a gun to his son's head and threatened to kill him over a debt involving drug use and stolen cash. Frank Jr. realized that his father's reformation was a lie and that upon their release, he would be pulled back into a life of violence and murder. This realization prompted the most significant betrayal in mob history. On July 27, 1998, Frank Calabrese Jr. wrote a letter that would change the course of organized crime history. Sent from the Federal Correctional Facility at Milan, Michigan, the letter was addressed to the FBI and stated simply that Frank Jr. wanted to help the government keep his father in prison for the rest of his life. Crucially, Frank Jr. did not ask for a reduced sentence, immunity, or money. He merely wanted to ensure that Frank Sr. would never be free to hurt his family or anyone else again. The FBI, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the offer, began a 7-year investigation dubbed Operation Family Secrets. Between February and June of 1999, Frank Jr. agreed to wear a body wire during his daily walks with his father in the prison exercise yard. Frank Jr. knew how to manipulate his father into talking, often by getting him angry, playing on his desire to boast about his past. The recordings were a goldmine. Frank Sr. admitted to committing multiple murders in great detail, including his role in the 1981 Cagnoni bombing and various flattenings from the 1970s. While Frank Jr. was recording his father in prison, the FBI was working to flip the other primary member of the Chinatown crew, Nicholas Calabrese. In January 2002, federal investigators confronted Nick with DNA evidence from the bloody glove dropped at the Fecarata scene 16 years prior. Faced with the prospect of a life sentence or even the death penalty, Nick made the decision to cooperate with the government. Nicholas Calabrese became the first made member of the Chicago outfit to testify against his own brothers and the organization's top leadership. His testimony was instrumental in helping the FBI solve 18 different gangland slayings. He admitted to his role in 14 of those murders, including the Spilatro brothers and Michael Albergo. As part of his cooperation agreement, Nick was spared a life sentence, eventually receiving 12 years in prison. Information provided by Nick and the tapes from Frank Jr. allowed the government to build an ironclad case, not just against Frank Sr., but against the entire structure of the Chicago outfit. The investigation expanded to include other high-ranking figures, such as James Little Jimmy Marcello, Joey the Clown Lombardo, Paul the Indian Shiro, and Anthony Twan Doyle. Operation Family Secrets was no longer just about the Calabrese family. It was an existential threat to the 100-year-old crime syndicate that had once been led by Al Capone. On April 25, 2005, the federal government initiated the Operation Family Secrets indictment, charging 14 defendants with murder, racketeering, extortion, and running an illegal gambling business. The indictment included 18 previously unsolved murders, many of which had been cold for over 30 years. After various plea agreements and the deaths of two defendants, including Frank Goomba Saladino and Michael Ricci, the case proceeded to trial in June 2007 with 5 main defendants: Frank Calabrese Sr., James Marcello, Joseph Lombardo, Paul Shiro, and Anthony Doyle. The trial was a media sensation in Chicago as it offered a rare peek into the inner workings of the outfit. The star witnesses were undoubtedly Frank Jr. and Nicholas Calabrese. Nick took the jury through each of the 14 killings he had participated in, describing the stranglers and the hit squads with a chilling lack of emotion. Frank Sr.'s defense strategy was to discredit his son and brother as drug addicts and liars who were merely looking for a way to keep him in prison to escape his discipline. His attorney, Joseph Lopez, portrayed the elder Calabrese as a cheese salesman who merely slapped his son for stealing and using crack cocaine. However, this defense was decimated by the hours of secretly recorded tapes in which Frank Sr. bragged about his role in various hits and spoke of the outfit family as something that came before blood and even before God. On August 30th, 2007, the trial concluded with a stunning victory for the federal government. All 5 defendants were found guilty of a racketeering conspiracy that included murder, extortion, and loan sharking. The jury specifically found Frank Calabrese Sr. responsible for 13 of the 14 outfit murders he was linked to. The reaction from the defendants was varied. While Marcello and Lombardo remained stoic, Frank Sr. was seen smiling and chuckling, apparently unfazed by the proceedings. However, the levity ended during the sentencing phase. On January 28, 2009, U.S. District Judge James Zagel sentenced the 71-year-old Calabrese to life in prison. Judge Zagel called the acts Calabrese had committed unspeakable and noted that the mobster had shown no remorse for the decades of misery he had caused. In addition to the life sentence, Calabrese was ordered to forfeit hundreds of thousands of dollars and pay $4.4 million in restitution to the families of his victims. Significant post-verdict detail emerged when a juror alleged that on August 27, 2007, Calabrese had said or mouthed the words, "You are a fucking dead man," to prosecutor T. Marcus Funk as he passed by the defense table. Although Calabrese denied the threat and his lawyers argued for a new trial, Judge Zagel denied the request, ruling that the threat had not tainted the jury's decision, but was rather a reflection of Calabrese's true nature. This outburst, combined with the forensic and testimonial evidence, ensured that Frank Calabrese Sr. would spend the rest of his natural life in a high-security federal facility. Following his sentencing, Calabrese was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Butler, North Carolina. Due to his history of violence and his potential for directing criminal activity from prison, he was placed under special administrative measures, a strict form of solitary confinement usually reserved for international terrorists. At the time, Calabrese was one of only 42 federal inmates under these restrictions. He was locked down 24 hours a day, had no interaction with other inmates, and even his meals were delivered via a series of automated doors to prevent him from compromising the guards. To combat the isolation and keep the mind crisp, Calabrese began creating a series of handmade dictionaries. Constructed from granola bar boxes, legal pads, and string, these books were filled with his personal definitions and associations. The dictionaries reflected his severe dyslexia with words spelled phonetically and often in all caps. His entries included corrupt equal judge is bad, verdict the judge gave me was wrong, and prison is where I am at. These artifacts, later donated to the Mob Museum, served as a psychological window into the mind of a man who remained defiant and manipulative until the very end. One of the final and most bizarre chapters of Frank Calabrese Sr.'s life involves a plot to recover a valuable violin. Calabrese was convinced that he had hidden a rare Stradivarius violin, one that he believed belonged to the entertainer Liberace, inside the walls of his former summer home in Williams Bay, Wisconsin. He claimed the instrument was worth as much as $26 million and had been received as payment for a juice loan years earlier. In 2011, while receiving communion from Father Eugene Klein in the prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri, Calabrese began passing notes to the priest about the violin. The plan was for Klein and a few unnamed conspirators to pose as potential buyers of the Wisconsin house, distract the real estate agent, and retrieve the violin from behind the second-floor bedroom wall. Calabrese reportedly told the priest that he would rather Klein profit from the sale than the government seize it for restitution. However, the plot was uncovered by the FBI, and Father Klein was eventually indicted for conspiracy to defraud the United States and attempting to prevent the seizure of Calabrese's property. In March 2010, while Calabrese was already serving his life sentence, federal agents returned to his former home at 14 Meadowwood Drive in Oak Brook with a final search warrant. Behind a family portrait in the basement, they discovered a secret compartment built into the wall. Inside, they found criminal activities, $730,000 in cash, over 1,000 pieces of jewelry, loaded handguns, and various property deeds. The discovery provided a final tangible link to the street taxes and juice loans that had fueled Calabrese's rise within the Chinatown crew. The cash and jewelry were estimated to exceed $1 million in value, which was seized to satisfy the restitution judgment for the victims' families. The imagery of a mob boss's secret loot hidden behind a family portrait became a powerful metaphor for the family secrets case itself. The cozy suburban existence of the Calabrese family was merely a front for a dark and violent interior that had been concealed for decades. Frank Calabrese Sr. died on Christmas Day, 2012, at the Federal Medical Center in Butler, North Carolina. At age 75 years old, he had spent the last 15 years of his life in prison, most of it in total isolation. He was on 17 different medications at the time of his death, yet he remained strong-willed and unrepentant until the end. His passing marked the end of an era for the Chicago outfit, as he was one of the last high-profile links to the hyper-violent enforcement tactics of the 1970s and 1980s. The aftermath of the family secrets trial saw the Chicago outfit severely diminished, though not entirely destroyed. High-ranking bosses like James Marcello and Joseph Lombardo also received life sentences, effectively decapitating the organization's leadership. Frank Calabrese Jr., the son who risked his life to wear a wire against his father, did not enter the witness protection program, but instead chose to remain in the public eye, often speaking at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas to reflect on the trauma of his upbringing. His brother Kurt, who also served time for his role in the family business, remained largely out the spotlight. Nicholas Calabrese, the hitman who broke the code of omerta, lived out his final years in protective custody, passing away somewhere in the USA in 2023 at the age of 80. So goes the story of Frank Calabrese. Frank Calabrese Sr. remains a chilling case study in the intersection of blood, loyalty, and criminal depravity. It proved that the most sophisticated criminal organizations are most vulnerable to the very families they seek to preserve. The family secrets that Frank Sr. believed protected by the blood oath on a holy card were eventually revealed by his own namesake, demonstrating that even in the world of the Chicago outfit, the truth eventually finds its way into the light. The artifacts of his life, a handmade dictionary, the secret basement cache, and the gurney that he died alone on a Christmas day in 2012, stand as a permanent testament to the fall of Frankie Breeze and the destruction of the family he claimed to serve. So what are James on the Mob's thoughts on Frank Calabrese Sr.? I think that Frank Calabrese Sr. rates in at least the top 5 of the most prolific killers in Chicago's history, Chicago's crime history. I think he rates up there comparatively with Roy DeMeo of New York. Not so much in numbers, but the mindset, the methodology, the assembly line process that they would probably apply, or that they did apply to murder. And in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on Frank Calabrese Sr. I'm James Jenkins. And if you've enjoyed this episode on Frankie Breeze, Calabrese, hit that like thumb, subscribe to the channel, and share. Be on the lookout for another James on the Mob episode. And remember, y'all, life is short, so don't whack it off. We'll see you next time.